Yeah.
Do you think the time frame of the Epic of Gilgamesh and like the story of the Teva and the Mabul coincide whatsoever? Do you think it's possibly talking about the same flood?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't studied the Epic of Gilgamesh, so I don't know what the details are, but I don't think the details would matter. The fact is that there are flood stories all over the world. There are some places where there aren't, for whatever reason, but in all the continents you have flood stories. Now, if the event took place really 4,000 years ago, you wouldn't expect everyone to preserve all the details in the same way. So we wouldn't be surprised if the stories didn't dovetail in a lot of their details, but that there is a common theme of story all over the world that needs to be explained. If I'm not mistaken, what was it? I tried to explain it on the basis of Freud, to try to explain it on psychoanalysis, the memories of birth coming out of water and that kind of thing, because it just seems like it's not a natural thing, you know. If you're talking about general destruction, one could have a story about an earthquake, and one could talk about a volcanic eruption, and one could have a story of a disease, and then this one could have a story of a flood. Why would there be a story of a flood all over the world? If it didn't happen, and there's some kind of human memory preserved of it. I wouldn't say it's a very strong argument, but it is something which does need to be explained. I thought you were going to ask something else. What people ask is that if you have a text of another culture which has a similar story, and we know that that text came into existence before, let's say, the 5 books of Moses came into existence, then they take it. It would be natural to think that we copied their story, changed it maybe, and adapted it to our culture, and so forth and so forth and so on. What that ignores is the existence of an oral tradition which goes back at least another 400 years before the existence of the Torah. So, that being the case, Jewish information existed, it just wasn't written down in an official book. It doesn't mean it wasn't written down, it wasn't written down in an official book. So, you don't date the origin of information from the origin of the first book that you have on record that records it. Indeed, it really works the other way around. Why did anybody bother to write it down? Was this competition in writing novels? Is that the idea? And this just became popular. That's probably not reasonable in the ancient world. They wrote it down because it was already a cultural tradition and became important to have a record of that cultural tradition. So that being the case, to say that the information originated from the time of the first text that contains it is very naive. So the fact that archaeologically their texts are older than the time in which the Torah came into existence would not be a good reason to think that their information came first. They could have copied it from our information.
Another question: do you think that the Mabul, like the water was supposedly like incredibly hot? Do you think that affected current dating whatsoever and like archaeological measurements?
I'll tell you. I used to say no, but I think there are secrets in chemistry that we don't know about. About, I guess maybe it's now 8 years ago or so, they made a compound which chemically should not exist. And they did it under something like 500,000 atmospheres of pressure, which in the lab you can do. It's not a shocking thing to do. You can increase pressure very greatly. Had something to do with calcium, I think. A lot of calcium atoms. This was written up in the journals. And the shocking thing was that after you made this very unexpected compound under gigantic pressure, when you took away the pressure, it was stable. So I thought to myself, boy, I never would have guessed that mere pressure would affect chemical bonds. chemical bonds, electromagnetic, they're very, very, very strong. And the idea that mere pressure would change the way the chemistry would work, to me was beyond acceptance. But when I saw this take place, I thought, who knows, if they can make this compound, which people thought was impossible under that kind of pressure, maybe pressure could change chemical reactions. No one's tried it, so it isn't as if we have direct evidence for or against it. So could the Mabul affect radioactivity, for example, which is a chemical effect, just the behavior of atoms? I don't know. At this point, I really don't know. The amount of water is very heavy. Water is very heavy, and it was the way it's described. The heat, I don't know about that either, frankly. Whether heat affects the speed of chemical reactions, but whether it would affect what kinds of atoms would combine, what kind of atoms make what kind of molecules, I really don't know. But what that result taught me is that even in well-established sciences like chemistry, which are stable, typically you don't make brand new revolutionary discoveries and say, we got to rethink chemistry and do it all over again. But it can happen, so we shouldn't rule out something that hasn't been tried. No one's really tested it. So I don't know what to say about that. Yeah.
About Yehuda HaNasi that wrote the Mishnah. So, as I understood, all through history, there was a tradition that compiled with groups of Rabbanim, Gottleib. So suddenly, one individual decides to write and break a verbal tradition, how
Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi u Beit Dino Chibru et HaMishnah. Sof pasuk. He had a bezdin. He had a whole group. It was a whole committee. It wasn't him alone. It wasn't. Period. Says so in the Gemara. Rashi says it in the Gemara. Wasn't alone. What you could ask is, if he had this committee and became the text of the oral tradition, how is it that in the Talmud, when they discuss the Mishnah, they sometimes come to a decision against the Mishnah? They paskin the law against the Mishnah. That happens often enough. And the answer is, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had his court, had his committee, and they sat and they went through it, and they sifted everything, and discussed it, and debated, and they voted on it, and they decided it. And later generations are free to decide differently. It wasn't binding on them. There's absolutely no reason for them not to abide by what's written in the Mishnah. The only legal text which is binding on all future generations is the Babylonian Talmud, and only when the Babylonian Talmud says we took a vote and we decided. When that happens, nothing can challenge that particular decision of the Babylonian Talmud. All others, before and after, are open to later question, without any reservation. Why was the Babylonian Talmud different? So Maimonides writes, two conditions were fulfilled. First of all, it was circulated to all the known Jewish communities, and they all accepted it upon themselves. Not that it was forced on them by some authority above. They accepted it upon themselves. And secondly, Ravina and Ravashi, the editors of the Babylonian Talmud, were Sov Baalei Ha'atoka. La'atik in Hebrew means to copy. They were the last among the scholars who could faithfully copy something. The Rambam doesn't explain that phrase anywhere, so that's I know of anyway, but those are the two criteria that he gives for the fact that the Babylonian Talmud cannot be challenged. But it's only when it reports a decision. For example, if the Babylonian Talmud raises a question and says, kasha, the question is unresolved, later generations can resolve it. So the Babylonian Talmud didn't resolve it, so they didn't resolve it. So later generations say, we've studied it and we think we can resolve it. And it's perfectly appropriate for them to do that. So it's unique in that way, but no other compilation, neither before it nor after it, had that status. So this is not a question of authority, it's a question of acceptance and a certain quality that these two, by the way, Ravina and Ravashi, who were the editors of the Babylonian Talmud, Ravina was from Eretz Yisrael. When I read that, I thought to myself, aha, the Babylonian Talmud was edited by one scholar from Eretz Israel. So the independent tradition, Eretz Israel, was brought to bear on the compilation of the Babylonian Talmud. That's one of the reasons why Babylonian Talmud has precedence. First of all, it's older, it's later, so it has precedence, but it has the input from an Eretz Israelic, an Israeli Jew who brought the Israeli tradition to the I've thought that my own. Somebody told me one of the Gaonim writes that. So this idea of authority and breaking with authority and tradition, there's nothing that binds later generations that they can't disagree with earlier generations. People will tell you that the Rishonim, so to speak, the medieval period, later period, can't disagree. That's just wrong. Just wrong. They can't. It's rare because you read what they've written and their scholarship and their scope is so overwhelming. You feel it's overwhelmingly likely I'm missing something. But the Gaon of Vilna did it typically. I saw in the Shakas Ari where he did it a couple of times. The Maharal will bring Rashi and disagree with Rashi. It's the Rambam disagrees with the Gaonim often. There's nothing to stop people from having their own points of view. By the way, you may be told that an Amora can't disagree with the sum total of all the Tanoim. That means the Mishnah and the Braisos and the Toseftos and all of it. The sum total of Tannaitic scholarship, an Amora is not allowed to go outside that entire body of scholarship. Well, first of all, there's a disagreement about it. But if you look to ask why he doesn't go outside, so the Kesef Mishnah, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, writing on the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim, says that the Amoraim decided not to. They took it upon themselves not to. Not that they couldn't. They have the authority to do it, and they just decided not to. The Chanan quotes Reb Chaim Brisker saying something else. He says that they can and did. There's one case where Rabbi Yochanan seems to have disagreed with all the Tanoim, and Tosfos talks about it, and Rabbi Chanan said they did. When you find in the Gemara, and the Gemara will take a position, and they'll quote a brisa against him, they'll say Tiyufta, which means he's refuted, and his position is wrong, says Rabbi Chanan over there, it's because we assume that the Amora didn't know the brisa, and had he known the brisa, he would have changed his mind. It was not supposed that the Amoraim knew all the brises. It's assumed by Tosfos several places that he knew all the Mishnah. They all knew the Mishnah by heart, but they didn't know all the brises. So here, the Amora didn't express himself on the brisa, didn't cite the brisa and say why he disagreed. So the assumption is he didn't know it. And had he known it, he would have changed his mind. But if he waves the flag and says, I know this brisa and this brisa and this Mishnah, and I'm against all of them, he has the right to do it. So again, it's not that there's an authority binding them and restricting their ability to make up their own minds. The only difference is the place where the Talmud says Hilchasa, there it's binding. Once in history, yeah.
So I've been struggling this past few days. How do you reconcile the lack of evidence when it comes to the Exodus of Egypt? And also, do you think the number of the people that were in the Exodus could have been distorted over time?
No, I don't think it could have been distorted over time, but nobody cares what I think. That's not going to count in a discussion of evidence. But I think that the evidence that you're using to question the tradition is extremely poor. I think it's extremely thin. Now, if you go onto my blog, I have about 20 articles on archaeology. I didn't write them. I took them from the archaeological literature. But I'll tell you about one of them, which is now I think only about 5 years old. This was an article in Haaretz. If you don't know about Haaretz, good for you. You don't need to know. Haaretz is the left-wing. This is the New York Times of Israel. Its readership is about 7%. It would be better if it was 0, but it was about 7%. And they're as left can be. And there was a discovery in the Arava Desert, and this article written by someone in Haaretz said, because of the discovery, we have to rethink all of biblical archaeology, to rethink the whole thing. What did they discover? Well, the tradition was that you estimate a population on the basis of its habitations. You're talking about the number of people on the basis of, right? They do it on the basis of habitations. Habitations are something you can discover archaeologically. Houses typically stay. They're not, they don't disintegrate. And you just count up how many people. Okay, you could say instead of 6 people living here, 16 people lived here. But it sets a limit on the size of the possible population. What about nomadic groups that don't build houses? They're small. They're disorganized. They don't have any political central organization. They're peripheral, small, drifting groups. Fine. They discovered in the Arava Desert an area which was devoted to copper mining. 10,000 shafts into the earth. Some of them 30 meters deep. 10,000 shafts. Tunnels connecting the shafts. Smelting areas. The debris of smelting copper. Okay? No houses at all. None. How is that possible? 10,000 shafts means the population has got to be, what? 40,000 people? 50,000 people? 100,000 people? It's got to be a large population. If they devoted this much effort to mining the copper, did somebody raise cows? Did somebody weave clothes? Did somebody make houses? It's a population. Not a trace of any housing. Well, that's a big gap in the record. That means that you can't count on houses to tell you how many people were there. Because you had a big, organized population with no housing at all. Well, then how are you going to estimate population size? Golly, maybe if the houses don't do it, and they don't have to leave any traces, you have no way to measure. You can measure that they were bigger than X, but you can't measure they were smaller than X. I went to Mexico City twice in the 80s, and at that time, the population of Mexico City was 16 million, 3 million homeless. I asked myself, 500 years from now, when they do an archaeological dig in Mexico City, how will they estimate the population? Will they estimate 3 million homeless? How will they do that? Why will they do that? Okay, you have a population in Israel of slaves. Do you think they had 2-story houses with indoor bathrooms? Probably not. Maybe they were just homeless, living on the land. Or maybe they had tents, which is what the assumption is of the ones who sunk the shafts in the Arava, that they lived in tents, and tents don't leave behind any trace. So, and by the way, they applied this to time to King David. Well, we see the population was very small because of the housing, and therefore it couldn't be that he had a big kingdom. It couldn't be, right? And then in the article, there's a verse where they all came to Yerushalayim, and then the king says to them, "Go back to your tents." So you know what the archaeologist said? They don't mean tents. Of course not. Nobody lives in tents. They really live in houses. That was just poetry. Really? Maybe it wasn't poetry. Maybe they really lived in tents. If they really live in tents, you won't find the houses. And maybe then the population was much bigger than you thought. No, it couldn't be. Because why? Because we're archaeologists. And we have this thing that we want to prove, and we take your verse and just discard it. You read this article. You can find it on my blog. You read this article and you think, boy, if they could make a mistake that big, I wonder what other mistakes they're making. The appeal to the archaeological record is extremely weak. It's speculative. It's full of second guessing. I remember years and years ago, this may be 20 or 30 years ago, when the Chizkiah's tunnel, which we have here in Yerushalayim. So someone did a carbon dating to find out how old it was, to see if it was really from the time of Chizkiah. And the introduction to the article was published in Nature, one of the world's 2 greatest science magazines. And they wrote in the introduction, this is the first accurate carbon dating that has been done in the land of Israel. Well, they've been done for 60 years. No, all the other ones were no good. Only no good. Only ours is good. Now, I don't know whether that's just chutzpah and gaiva, just pride, but it sounds like a disagreement about methods, and to agree what methods are correct, methods are incorrect. So then they say, well, we did a carbon dating. Well, so what? Maybe the other guy thinks your carbon dating is worthless. So the whole thing is presented as if it's a verified science and so forth and so on. It is very far from so being. So I would just, this business of the camels weren't domesticated at that time. They were domesticated. They ignored certain things because they thought that they were out of place and so forth. There's a lot of this stuff going on. When was Jericho conquered? So Dame Kathleen Kenyon, who was knighted by the British Empire for her services to archaeology, says it was at least 100 years before Joshua, so it couldn't be that Joshua conquered it. It was a myth that was made up to glorify her ancestors. So someone after her analyzed her work. First of all, there was a guy named Garstang, I think, in the 30s, who dug up a lot of the stuff from Jericho. She ignored what he did. And second of all, she was looking for pottery. That was the gold standard of dating. Pottery circulates, in particular places produce new styles of pottery, and they circulate. And then you can see when it was produced, how long it took to get there. So you can date things by pottery. But she sunk 2 shafts into the tell of Jericho, and she admits both of them went into the poor quarter of the city. And she's looking for imported pottery. Oh, is that where you would expect to find imported pottery? Where the poor people live? I don't think so. So you, on the basis of not finding it in the poor quarters, you date the whole city to be 100 years earlier. And, you read enough of this, you begin to get skeptical about the whole enterprise. So I wouldn't take the whole enterprise too seriously. And I invite you to look at my blog. It's on blogger.com. And if you have trouble finding the articles, you can write to me, because somebody asked me about it. I went through all of it. Sometimes the titles, I'm not good with the tags. So if you look up archaeology, you might or might not find it. But if you say, I listed them all in a few emails to somebody. Like I said, there's 20 articles there, which will, I think, dampen your enthusiasm for archaeology.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
The Egyptians kept very, very good records. They were known as a society to be great record keepers, and they kept it all carved out in stone. Why is there not a single reference to the 10 plagues, the exodus of what would have been 3 million people, which would have been a huge part of their population at the time?
Go through the records of the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and find me a single case of an official record of a gigantic defeat.
You're saying they hide their defeats?
Absolutely. The records were kept by the kings for the glorification of the king. That was their purpose. That's known about the content of ancient histories. They weren't histories in our sense. The first people to try to do histories in our sense were the Greeks. And they went around to other countries to try to systematize their records and bring them together. But they did not keep a record of the defeats. And then, to the contrary, there is a record, but it's much later. There was an Egyptian priest named Manetho, who lived in the 2nd century BCE, and he writes that there was an Exodus. That's 1,000 years after it happened, but either he's writing a novel or he's copying Jewish sources, not likely for an Egyptian priest. And he says that the Jews were there and the Jews left, and listen to what he says. He says, they left because we threw them out because they were leprous. So when I first read that, I said, okay, that's his spin. He's telling it in a way that'll make him look good. But I thought to myself, wait a minute. What do the Psukim say? The Psukim say, on the night of the Exodus, so there was the death of the firstborn, and the Egyptians pushed the Jews out. They did push them out. He's right about that. He said, because we're all dead men as long as you're here. You're here, we're all dying. So all he did was he made up leprosy. But the whole story is correct. This is 1,000 years after it happened in an Egyptian source. The kings aren't going to keep a record of it because it's not to their credit. It's not to their glory. That's the standard answer for ancient records. Yeah.
My question is again about the concept of Kochi V'Otzem Yadi and the level of bitachon. I want to ask it with some example, scenario. So let's say there is
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the words you said. About what are you asking?
V'Otzem Yadi, and the level of one bitachon, emunah.
Kochi V'Otzem
Kochi V'Otzem Yadi.
Oh, Kochi V'Otzem Yadi. Okay, right.
So let's further. There is a Torah that sits and learn Torah, and there is one that coming for him and wants to kill him.
Yeah.
And this person has like a strong belief, and it's a very high bitachon that Hashem will protect him. And then this individual got murdered.
Yeah.
Then what would we say? Would we say he's a tzaddik the way he went? Or would we say that he should have done it? He should just go up, close the Torah and the Gemara, and run away.
Well, I think we would have said neither of those, but the basis on which we would say it is not, look how silly the Torah is, we know better than it does, and we are more practical and cleverer than it is. What we would say is, he didn't follow the Torah's rules. He did not follow the Torah's rules by sitting there and just studying Torah when he's in danger. He didn't do what the Torah told him to do. You know this because we spoke about it last week. God said to do that. So if he didn't do that, he did something wrong. That's easy. I wouldn't say he was a tzaddik and Torah. I would just say he didn't do the right thing. Jacob, this week's parsha, this week's parsha. He's coming back to Israel. Esau's coming with 400 men. What does Jacob do? Number one, he sends a bribe to his brother. Maybe he can win him over by paying him off. Number two, he splits the camps and says if there's a war, at least one camp will be saved. And then he prays to God. He believes that God is going to control the outcome, but it doesn't stop him from taking practical measures to try to ensure the outcome himself. That's what you're supposed to do. King David fought wars. Nobody holds him to account and say his faith wasn't perfect, his trust wasn't perfect because he fought wars. On the contrary, Rav Dester has a whole essay on this. His bitachon was so perfect that he could fight wars and not have his trust in God degraded by that. And later kings did less than he because they were afraid. They couldn't do what King David did. King David is the ideal, and he fought the wars. So if he just sits there and waits for God to save him, we say he did the wrong thing. That's all. Yeah.
I just recently watched Schroeder's explanation on time dilation and how the 6 days line up with 13.8 billion years. I think that's a valid explanation on it kind of ties in evolution, it ties in the scientific age of the universe. Do you think it's a valid Torah perspective?
Look, I read his first book, and I had a number of comments, which are on my website. They're still there, page by page. And I sent it to him, and I never got an answer. And a new edition came out many years later with no changes. I don't think that his science is correct. And I think he made remarks about Torah that are incorrect also. I think the book has weaknesses of various kinds. Now look, people are human and people make mistakes. But I pointed them out. In the first book, he was using gravity to slow down clocks, which in a certain sense it does. And then the idea was that the gravity of the whole universe, some total mass of the universe, gravitational effect, would slow down a clock to the extent that 15 billion years, they thought it was 15 then, now it's 13.8 or 7. 15 billion years, we slowed down to 6 days. So he says, it depends upon your point of view. If you're looking at your local clock where you are, so then maybe it's 15 billion years. But if you look from God's point of view, it would only be 6 days. The Torah is talking about God's point of view. Well, there are a number of things wrong with that, but the chief thing wrong with it is this. Time is what clocks do. Quotation from Einstein. You don't measure time with a clock. Time is what clocks do. It's clocks that are time. So if you're going to talk about a clock being slowed down by gravity, the gravity of the mass of the universe, you have to tell me, where is this clock? Where is it? And ideally, what's it made of? But it could be a cesium atom. It could be the vibrations of a cesium atom, what they use today. I don't mind. The question is, where is it? How come, if the sum total mass of the universe slows down clocks to the point where 15 billion years with 6 days, how come my watch runs so fast? Why doesn't the sum total of the mass of the universe slow down my watch? If you put it close to a black hole, then vis-a-vis the rest of the universe, it will slow down. But what about, I'm sitting here not next to a black hole. Why doesn't the sum total of the mass of the universe, its gravitational strength, slow down my clock? The answer is because I'm surrounded by it, and it cancels itself out. How much would you weigh at the core of the earth? Nothing, because there's nothing to attract you. So that being the case, if the clock we're talking about is in the universe, so then it's surrounded by the mass of the universe, and it won't be slowed down. And I hope you understand that according to official relativity, right, every place in the universe is surrounded by everything else. It's like on the surface of a sphere, that every point has the rest of the sphere as its environment. There's no center where there's an edge. There are no edges. Okay. So then, and he realizes this in the book. So at one point he says that the clock has to be at the edge of the universe. But according to current cosmology, there isn't any edge to the universe. And another place in the book he says it's got to be outside the universe, because otherwise you can't get the sum total of the gravitation to affect the clock in a way that doesn't cancel out. But there's no place outside the universe. So no scientist is going to buy the idea that it's at the edge or that it's outside. Those are non-scientific ideas. So the thing is, it doesn't get off the ground. So I read that, and I wrote the argument, and I got no answer, and I didn't see that he changed anything. Now, I know there were later additions and different time dilations over the run. I lost my interest at that point. I don't hear the methodology that's one that I can. Maybe I should read the later editions, but so I'm not impressed, and I'm not impressed. I don't feel. Some people feel their back is to the wall because science says so. So we're in trouble. So we really have to, we have to work to somehow get in touch with science. Become consistent with. Otherwise, we're really in trouble. Well, I don't feel that kind of pressure. I know a little bit about science, and I have some reasons for being skeptical of the kinds of things that they produce. So I don't feel the pressure. I'll tell you briefly what the Rambam says. We have a problem with 13.8 billion years versus 6,000. He had a much bigger problem. In his days, they believed in Aristotle, the world is infinitely old. That's much bigger than 13.8 billion, isn't it? Infinity versus a finite history. And all the intellectuals believed that. The Rambam says, I want you to imagine a boy who's born and whose mother dies a few months after he's born, and then his father takes him to a colony of men, all men. This is part 2, chapter 17 in the guide. And when he grows up, he asks his father, the other adults, where did we come from? We, people. And the answer he gets is this. Well, there are others who are like us in many ways, and different in some ways, and we all start out as miniatures inside the abdomen of one of them. And we're inside the abdomen for 9 months, and then we are expelled, and we grow to be the way you see us now. Oh, says the boy, well, tell me, when we're inside the abdomen of those others, can we breathe? The answer is no. Can we eat? No. Can we drink? No. So he says, I know you're wrong. You know you're wrong. You know very well someone who doesn't breathe for 6 minutes is dead. You know that, don't you? Someone who doesn't drink for 2 months is dead. Someone who doesn't eat for 6 months is dead. You're telling me an impossible story. Look at the world around you. Things don't work that way. What's the answer to him? The answer is, you're right if you look at the world around you. Right. You look at the way things live, you look at the way things die, and you have a correct picture of the way things live and die in your environment. But not everything is like your environment. When we're inside the abdomen of those others, we survive without eating, without drinking, and without breathing. Because we're nourished in a different way. And we're developed in a different way. A way that you don't know, and given your present experience, it will be hard for you to even imagine. Okay, says the Rambam. Everything we know about the way our world works is the way it works after the end of the sixth day of creation. We are downhill from those first 6 days, and what we call the laws of nature are what came into existence and were finalized at the end of the 6 days. So we take those laws and we say, if I use these laws and I took the things that are in front of me and I project them backwards, I get 13.8 billion years. But that's assuming that the laws always were that way. It's assuming that there's no hidden pocket of different character of the creation, which runs on different principles, different ideas, different rules. And if you make that assumption and you're wrong, then you're going to get wrong results. The Rambam writes explicitly that during the first 6 days, the 6 days of creation were also the 6 days of creation of the regularities of the universe. They're being created also. That means they weren't there from the beginning. So things can happen during the 6 days, which couldn't happen later. Now, one easy way to say it, I don't say it's the only way, maybe even certainly not uniquely the best way, but Rav Schwab put it this way. Let's just say that during the first 6 days, things happen much faster. Millions of times faster. Billions of times faster. So they were dinosaurs. Instead of lasting for 60 million years, they last for 6 seconds. And all the fossils are fossils, and all the life cycles are cycles, and all the different types of creatures that are all there, it just happened much faster. You'll tell me that it's physically impossible for it to happen. That's correct. Physically impossible according to the laws that are operating now. But they weren't always operating that way. That's our picture. The use of laws unrestrictedly, as if there were no change in the laws, is an assumption, but it's only an assumption. It's not something that can be demonstrated on empirical grounds. In fact, one of the great founders of quantum mechanics said explorations into the early universe are generally suspect because the laws themselves have been evolving. And we don't know how they evolved. So, that being the case, somebody says to me 13.8 billion, I say, yeah, I understand. You're using a certain method, and this is the result you get from the method, and you have certain predilection for that method over thinking of other things. I hear that. And listen, a method is a method. Use it, and follow out its consequences, and record them, and publicize them. This is what you get when you use this method. Just be aware that there are other methods, and you're just using one method. That's all.
That's how you reconcile age of the universe and evolution?
I didn't talk about evolution at all. Evolution is much, much worse. I think there are straightforward physical reasons to disagree with evolution. And there are two types of disagreement. One is that the evidence does not support evolution to the extent that you should agree that it's true. It's way, way far short of that. And worse than that, there's some evidence which actually contradicts evolution. There's a fellow named David Galerner who happens to be a professor of computer science at Yale. So I suppose he's not dumb, huh? And he wrote an essay called Farewell to Darwin. It was published in the Claremont Review of Books, reviewing, what's his name's book, Signature in the Cell, by, what am I naming? It'll come back to me. So you can look it up, Claremont Book of Review of Books, David Galerner. I have it on my website as well. Or maybe I put it on the blog. I don't remember where I put it. I put it on the blog. I wasn't using the website then. And he writes about the folding of proteins. And given what we know about how proteins fold and what the processes are and what the alternatives are in the space of all possible proteins, to have two coordinated proteins would take orders of magnitude longer than the life of the whole universe. And we have hundreds of proteins. So it's just overwhelming mathematically that it can't happen in the space of time. So, he's obviously a revolving genius, and he's a computer scientist, he knows math. I suppose you could disagree with him, but at least it would be a disagreement. And he used to believe in, and he's not religious. Oh, he is religious. He's a religious Jew. But he doesn't believe in intelligent design. And he thinks evolution is useful for shaping the characteristics within species. But after all, Darwin's book was called Origin of Species, right? And if you can't explain where new species come from, you've lost the game. So if you can tell me why this bird's beak is longer, this bird's beak is shorter, okay, yeah, you could do that. And maybe it's right. But shaping the larger groups of life, he says, is mathematically impossible. So I invite you to read it and see that evolution has serious, straightforward scientific and mathematical problems.
Do you disagree with macroevolution at all? Not microevolution, but macroevolution.
I think that's right. I don't know if you're aware of the vicious anti-ID arguments, which are full of lies, but they will tell you that this macro and microevolution was invented by the ID creationist fifth column who really want to take over the world and make everybody religious. But in fact, it was Dobzhansky, who was a bona fide believer in evolution, who invented the terminology. And Stephen Jay Gould writes, the processes of microevolution are not the same as those of macroevolution. He believed in species evolution. And the small variations don't graduate smoothly into the large differences. This is Stephen Jay Gould writing. I guess if he was a professor at Harvard, he wasn't dumb, and he certainly was a believer in evolution generally, and he wasn't religious. He was Jewish, maybe that's enough to disqualify him, but he wasn't religious. So, and he says, yeah, you can't generalize from microevolution to macroevolution. So, these are not small people. And when I talk about science, I'm not a scientist. I am a philosopher. My field is philosophy of mathematics. I know a lot about philosophy of science also, so I can speak on my own. When I talk about science, I quote these scientists, and nobody can question their credentials, so I have to modify their views a bit. Yeah, was noch?
What about the idea that one day in the eyes of Hashem equates 1,000 years, right? So 6 days, 6,000 years, right? So to Hashem, our whole life can be he can see what we did in a second. It doesn't need technology, fast forwarding. He has all that, right?
Yeah, but the first thing you ought to start with is he wrote the book for us. We're not peeking at his private notes and trying to figure out what he means when he's writing for himself. He wrote the book to us. He wrote the books to us to understand. This is similar to when people say, well, who knows what God means by good? Who knows what God means by justice? We couldn't presume to know the infinite mind of the Creator when he says good and justice. So then, when it says be good, I don't know what he means. Because I don't know what he means when he means good. That's, I think, misplaced. He wrote the book for us. He's communicating to us. We're supposed to get something out of it. He's telling us something about what is and how things work and what we're supposed to do. We better be able to read it and understand it in our own terminology. Yeah, our concepts could be vague. Our concepts could need some work because sometimes they're contradictory. That's true. But to tell me that justice is really butterflies and goodness is really canals, no, that's not going to be on the page. And you're telling me a day is 1,000, and 1,000 is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1,000 years of hours, so you have to multiply the years by the hours. That's how you get to millions and billions. That would mean that the people for whom it was written had no clue what it meant. That's unlikely. He wrote the book and gave it to the Jewish people in the wilderness and told them, this is my Torah for you. So I think that's extremely unlikely. And furthermore, the numbers don't work out unless you gerrymander them, and then you gerrymander to get 15 billion because they were doing it 20 years ago, and now it's 13.8 billion. You've got to change the gerrymandering, to trim the thing a little bit so to get it to be right. The thing is ad hoc and very artificial. Now, if you look at the first chapter of Genesis, you have a problem because the first 3 days don't have the sun in its position to measure days by. And the 6 days have exactly the same verbiage, the same phrases govern all 6 days. So to say that 3 were one way and 3 another way is very unlikely in the text. So now you have to ask yourselves, it's a tug of war here. Shall I interpret the first 3 like the last 3? Or shall I interpret the last 3 like the first 3? So you say, well, since the sun wasn't in there, and all it talks about a variation between light and darkness. It doesn't explain where the light and darkness are coming from. So who knows, but maybe that's hundreds of thousands or billions of years, right? But then the last 3 days, the sun is there. So presumably, Vayerev vayivoker, evening and morning, is the words the text uses, when the sun is in the sky, would be our evening and morning. So you say, well, no. So the first three are billions. The last three, ignore the sun, ignore evening and morning, and say they're all billions. That's one way to go. The other way to go is the last three are morning and evening with the sun in the sky. They're 24-hour periods. And the first three are also 24-hour periods without the sun in the sky. But the amount of time is the same. Now here comes a parting of ways. What do you take yourself to be responsible for when you do the job of looking at astronomy and cosmology and evolution and the rest through the eyes of Torah? What's Torah? The first chapter of Genesis? All 6 pages of it? Is that it? Just reconcile it with those 6 pages? What about the rest of the 1,000 pages of Tanakh? What about the entire oral tradition? Does that count or doesn't it? That's a big difference. The Christians do it the first way. All they have is the 5 books of Moses plus their New Testament, and they think that's all they have to do. And about creation, it's only the first chapter of Genesis. But we have a whole tradition. Our tradition, almost every major authority says that the 6 days were 6 24-hour periods. So, if you're just looking to work and you want to step outside the tradition against Maimonides, against Nachmanides, against Abarbanel, against all of them, I think you're stepping into a vacuum. We want to have a view that's based on the sum total of the tradition. That being the case, we're going to look at it as 6 24-hour days. And as I said, if it's a tug of war between the first 3 and the last 3, the text doesn't tell you which way to go. I think it indicates a little bit to use the last 3 because the last 3 are exact. There's a principle in understanding Torah. If an idea is clearly explained in one place, and in another place you don't have the clear explanation, you import the explanation from over here to explain it over there. The text didn't explain it twice, but once. I know this is an unrealistic expectation, but the text thinks you're going to read the whole text. Nobody does that. They take 1 page out of Exodus and say, what are you going to say about this? What about the whole book of Deuteronomy? Well, I didn't read that. So, but if you read the whole thing and you see that over here, the last 3 are explicitly our 24-hour days, and the first 3, you don't know what they are, then you use what we have explicit to interpret the ones that's not. If you had, in the tug of war between the first 3 and the last 3, that's the most likely way to go. I wouldn't say you have to, but it's the most likely way to go. So that certainly is the way that the tradition goes. So then I'm not going to take seriously the idea that they were really billions of years. Yeah.
In terms of events or things that happen, also to the prat and to the klal, how are we supposed to view them and look at them in terms of like Hashgacha Pratis versus like mikreh?
Oh yeah, I'm writing a whole book on that subject. Individual providence and general providence. It's a big subject. I'll just tell you one headline to give you an idea of what needs to be done. But I so far have 150 pages and I'm still working on it. So it's not a short idea. The Ramban says when Hakadosh Baruch Hu speaks to Abraham before he tells him about the destruction of stone, Hakadosh Baruch Hu says, shall I hide what I'm saying from Abraham? No, he has a whole community and he's teaching them my way and my mitzvos and everything else. He says, Ki yidativ, for I know him. Well, of course, because he knows everything, right? So the Ramban and others say the word yidativ there means providence, individual providence. And he says, great tzaddikim, great pious people, and klalim, general categories, get individual providence. Everything else is placed in it in mikreh, your word mikreh, of chance. That's what he says there. Okay? So great tzaddikim, yes, and everything else not, except for the general categories, whatever that means. Now you look at the end of Parshas Bo, the famous Ramban, where he says that open miracles teach you about hidden miracles, and everything that happens to a person is hidden miracles. Anyone who believes that there's any mikreh has no share in God's Torah, in Moses' Torah. He said, hey, now, come on. Over here you said that only tzaddikim have providence, and there is mikreh. And over here you said anybody who believes in mikreh has no share in Moses' Torah. Wow, how can you write both of those things? The answer is that the word providence has 2 different usages, 2 categorically different usages. One is for causation, management, and control of the world. That's one. Causation, management, and control of the world. And the other is for preserving or certain purposes for which things should be done. Causation, management, control is a fact of who's running it without any indication of why, for what purpose, to what end. And the other is in a different category. It's a purpose. The purpose that he's talking about there in Genesis is preservation. So, causation, control goes down to everything that happens to everyone. Nothing is hefker. Nothing is blind chance. No, God didn't make the laws of nature go on vacation. There isn't any such thing. Everything that happens to a person is caused directly by God to that person. But you don't know why. In Genesis, it's talking specifically about preservation, protection from danger. That only great tzaddikim get. Just think about reward and punishment. Isn't reward and punishment individual providence? Doesn't everybody have his own record? Doesn't he have his unique life, his unique set of actions? Isn't he going to get a reward or a punishment tailor-made just for him? Does that apply only to great tzaddikim? It applies to everyone with free will. So, if you talk about a different purpose, then you'll get a different result. But management, causation, and control, that's universal. In fact, the Rambam says that it goes down below the human reality. Rambam doesn't say it explicitly. Down to the tiniest thing. Down to the tiniest thing, he quotes a Chazal about it. So, it depends on what you're asking about. Are you asking whether God is like deism? He created the world and went on vacation, and the thing runs on its own? That's absolutely out of the picture. But if you talk about what kinds of treatment they get, they'll vary from person to person or from group to group. That's the starting point, and everything has to be put into one of the two categories and calculated that way.